It's the week ending Saturday the 5th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump charged in court for his involvement in the January 6th insurrection, Rishi Sunak accused of backsliding on climate change after permitting more North Sea oil and gas exploration, and Stuart Broad ending his cricket career on a high after winning an Ashes Test match. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week, big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from Money Week and the Money Edit, it's Guy Anker. From Daily Podcast, Today in History with the Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. And poised to hit the road at the Camden Fringe, it's comedy genius Suchandrika Chakrabarti. No Edinburgh for you this year, Suchandrika.
Not this year. The finances were a bit tough, as we hear all over the news. The Edinburgh Fringe is very expensive. So I'm bringing my show to Camden Fringe instead. And I'd say it's a work in progress. It still needs a little more work. And the audience helps me figure out what's good about the show. So
Don't say that. We're trying to flog your tickets.
Collaboration.
Work in progress.
That's what we call it.
Okay. Guy, you're starting the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are millions of UK savers getting a raw deal?
This is all about whether banks are treating their customers fairly. It's about whether competition is really working for savers. But there is also a lot of money at stake here. And of course, that matters when you're in the midst of a cost of living crisis. So look, 70% of us have a savings account of some sort. And right now there's 1.5 trillion pounds in those accounts. That is a huge sum of money. And as a result, very small differences in interest rates can make a lot of impact on some people. I mean, 0.1% on that could generate income of 1.5 billion pounds for somebody.
Neil MacDonald there reporting for Channel 4 News on Monday. Guy, what's happened this week?
Yeah, so this week, the UK's financial watchdog, the Financial Conduct Authority, has warned banks they're going to face robust action, in its words, on unjustifiably low savings rates. Now, over the past 18 months or so, the Bank of England base rate has been going up. Most recently, it's just gone up to 5.25%. And what's happening is that banks seem to be very quick to pass on those rises to borrowers, and they've been much slower to pass on that rise to savers. Just interesting stats, a couple of stats actually. So of the 9 big banks, between January 2022 and May 2023, the Financial Conduct Authority found that 28% of them passed on base rate rises on their easy access accounts. That's where you can get money out when you want. About 50% on their notice accounts, where you have to give some form of notice, or where there's a fixed rate. In contrast, 90% of borrowing accounts had the full base rate rise passed on. That just shows you in numbers the difference.
Yeah, so the real problem here is if you choose not to lock your money away. If you choose to lock your money away for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, you're getting a better deal. But the issue is obviously in these turbulent times, Guy, people want easy access to their savings if you're lucky to have any. I mean, my bank account that I use for my employment, so what I get paid for doing this into, has a savings account linked to it that's at 1.8%. I'm always like in disbelief when I open the app and I see that amount, seeing what's in the headlines.
Yeah, and we've got banks offering deals to new customers now at around that sort of rate, as 1 point something percent. There are legacy accounts which are no longer on sale that are offering even less than 1%. In contrast, what we tend to call the challenger banks, the smaller banks, not the big high street banks, they're offering the best rates, generally speaking, at the moment. You can currently get, as we're recording this, you can get just over 4.5% on an easy access account. You can get just over 6% if you're prepared to lock your money away for a few years. Now, of course, rates change very quickly. That might not be the rate when you're actually looking as you're listening to this, but it just shows the difference. Some banks at 1%, some at 6%. There's a massive gap. And generally speaking, if you're with one of the big high street names, there'll be some exceptions, but if you're with one of the big high street names, you're probably not getting a very good deal on your savings. And you said, Olly, those lucky enough to have savings, which I think is the right way to put it in this in the state we're in the cost of living crisis. But as we heard on that report, 70% of people actually do have a savings account. There are more savers than there are mortgage holders and loan holders in the UK. So there's still a massive population of people that are simply not getting a good deal. But vote with your feet is what I say. I've just told you that generally the high street's rubbish and the challenger banks are good. Go to a challenger bank. They're all regulated, so your money's safe up to £85,000 per person per institution, even if the bank was to go bust, which is very unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a savings account to pay my tax. That's what it's for. It's not for me. It's so that I can put money aside so I can pay my tax bill as a freelancer. But Arion, there was all that furore about Nigel Farage's bank account last week. Now there's this story demonstrating that interest rates aren't being passed on, which anecdotally people have been saying anyway. But here is the FCA saying it's not happening. It's just a general feeling of kind of helplessness, really, isn't there?
Yeah, I think we all sort of come to just expect that banks are taking advantage of us, but it's stories like this that really ram home that there are ways that you can actually do something about it. And they're the sorts of things that Guy is talking about here, because, the downside of this moment that we're living with of high interest rates means that if you're a mortgage payer, for example, you're going to be outlaying a lot more money than you used to, particularly if you're on a variable rate. But there should be an upside if you are among that group of 70% of the country who have some sort of savings, which is that you should also benefit from higher interest rates. But what we're seeing here is commercial banks benefiting from this widening gap between what they pay savers and what they charge borrowers. And this is known as the net interest margin. And Britain's 4 largest banks all recently reported that they've widened this margin. And leading the charge has been NatWest, which has increased its margin by 24%, while Lloyds Banking Group is up by 16%. And what this means basically is, if you are not benefiting from a higher interest rate in your personal account, say you had your money invested in an account that had about a sort of 1.8% rate, which is fairly standard in easy access accounts at the moment. If you had £30,000, you'd stand to earn about £500 in a year. But if the rate was being passed on to you in full, which is sort of around 4% at the moment, that would jump to about £1,000. So it's big amounts of money that we're talking about people missing out on in their back pocket due to this failure on the part of the banks.
Yeah, and you've got to look at the demographics as well, Suchandrika. I mean, it's all very well talking about challenger banks, but which is the demo that's most likely to go out seeking those? I would argue the under 40s, let's say, right? And actually, my parents' generation are the ones who are going to be using the high street banks, and when they want to move their money, they're going to literally go to a branch of a bank and have a conversation with a bank manager. And that's the generation with savings, and they're being ripped off.
I mean, do you want to hear about some of the worst rates for savers accounts in the UK? Because I saw a list. This is money.co.uk. Thank you very much. So the worst saving rates, they're so low, these are ridiculous. They're from Clydesdale Bank, Virgin Money and Yorkshire Bank, 0.2%. Which century is that from? That's utterly terrible. As you mentioned, Ollie, it is people who are loyal to their banks. They're often the older generation, and they often find it harder in the time of digital banking to change. I mean, I'm not one to speak.
And to change within the bank as well, that's the other thing. I mean, you mentioned Virgin Money. I saw they were on a list of one of the best savings accounts too, right? So that what they do is they don't necessarily tell their own customers. They just need to call up and switch it within the bank.
There are often better deals for new customers as opposed to existing customers moving. I have to say, I'm not one to speak. I've had my same bank account since I was 7 and my dad opened it for me. So with £1.50, thanks, Dad. It's grown since then. Not much. And then at the other end of the scale, it doesn't get over 2% on this list. At the other end of the scale, you still have Virgin Money. They've got several accounts or different types of account on this list. You've got Lloyds Bank, you've got M&S Bank, and the absolute most is 1.8% on this list.
And that's for easy access savings, is it?
They are, yes, yeah. Which at the moment is kind of what people need to feel secure.
So, Guy, what are the FCA actually going to do about this? Because in my reading of it, it's a bit of a rap of the knuckles. You know, what they've said this week is, quote, firms offering the lowest savings rates will be required to justify by the end of August how those rates offer fair value. That doesn't sound that scary if you're a massive bank. I mean, you presumably have someone in-house who can fluff that information pretty effectively and say, yes, we're offering the best value for these reasons. And then that's it. I mean, what happens to these banks?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's exactly what was going through my mind. I suspect what happens in those conversations is they get the compliance people in and they look really serious, and compliance people say, yeah, well, yeah, I'm really sorry about this. And they go away and go, oh, we can get around this. To answer your question, a few things that they've said they'll do. They will publish analysis every 6 months of firms' rates, essentially naming and shaming the poor ones. But like as Suchandrika said, that information is widely available anyway in the public domain. We're all, we're doing that at Money Week. This is Money, as he said, have done it. We're all doing that to make, encourage people to get out of those accounts. They're going to require firms with the lowest rates to provide what they call a fair value assessment. To demonstrate why. They'll review the timing of firm savings rate changes each time there is a base rate change. It does feel like rather toothless. Having said that, to be fair to them, they're not a price regulator. This isn't communist Soviet Union where the price is determined by a central source. In the same way, I know if I'm buying butter, it will be cheaper from one store than it will from another. That's my choice to go to the cheapest store. It's probably no different to one bank offering a good rate, one offering a poor rate. But the problem we have here is that as an industry, we're seeing the big collective of the big banks, with the odd exception, but the big collective of the big banks giving people a raw deal. That's what they're looking into. But I, like you, Ollie, I'm skeptical about just how much teeth the regulator really has here.
And is it sort of ethically justifiable, do you think, Arion, for bankers, who after all tend to get into their job because they like money, that's the thing they're interested in, to say, you know what, until the regulations change, we're not doing anything illegal here. We are making money. We would rather have borrowers than savers, and those are our rates.
I mean, if that helps them sleep at night, sure, that's what they can tell themselves. I think that the ethical question would be, it seems fair that people benefit from higher interest rates in a sort of, communal way, in the same way, I suppose, as we accept the idea that we have a central bank that is manipulating monetary policy, trying to prevent the harm that's coming to us via inflation. All of this is a very complex question, and I suppose we take some of the bad, but we also expect the good. And if we're asking about this on a moral level, then I think there is some imperative on the banks to do something about this. There is sort of this growing clamor for windfall taxes to be introduced. And, that's the idea that any banks that are benefiting massively from what's going on in terms of, the monetary policy that's being imposed upon us, that they have to contribute back in the form of taxation to the government. And there's really positive benefits that could come from that. The government could look to use that added money in its coffers to help provide relief to people struggling with their own mortgage repayments, for example. That is an idea that's being floated. So there's lots of ways in which you could imagine that taxing banks at points where they are making more money in a way that we feel doesn't reflect our sort of moral take on the world could be a fair solution to this.
Suchandrika.
Yeah, the question for Guy being the money expert here. I think so with what the government's trying to do with the interest rates going up and spending becoming more expensive, how does it affect sort of the economic equation if we're not also seeing our savings grow? It seems like only one side of the economic theory is being put into action. Surely it's very short-sighted to not then also make sure that savers are seeing returns on their money. Like, how does that work?
The idea of putting interest rates up, if you go back to sort of A-level GCSE economics, is you encourage saving because your money is going to grow faster, and so you spend less. But by the same token, borrowing costs more, so it's harder to then if you want to buy a car or do your kitchen up, it's going to cost you more to borrow if you need to. So you're less likely to do that. And that helps to control prices and bring down inflation because that creates less demand, and therefore less demand, assuming supply doesn't change, means prices come down. That's the theory behind it. I think your point is, well, hang on a minute, savings rates aren't going up. They are going up, though. Having said that, the problem is they're not going up at the pace the regulator wants to see, and they're not going up at the same pace that borrowing rates are going up. So overall, as a society, we're getting a raw deal. But as I said, it's, if you are one of the people lucky enough to have savings and you are getting a raw deal, I think anything below about 4% is probably raw deal level at the moment. Listen, if you're on 4.1, you can do better, but it's not a bad deal. If you're getting less than 4%, I would shop around for a new deal. Generally speaking, it's not going to be your big high street banks, but the only way to find out is, if you're online, go to an online comparison site. There's lots of them. Or, go to This Is Money, as you mentioned, Suchandrika. Go to one of my sites, Money Week. Go to Money Saving Expert. All of us across the industry, we all have best buy tables. Find out what the best rate is at the time. We're recording this now. It's not what we say today is not necessarily going to be the best rate in an hour, let alone a couple of days. Find out the best rate at the time. Move your money. It's so quick to move money these days and open a savings account. It's so easy. There's no credit checks. It's not difficult. There's nothing to be scared about. And crucially, you are protected up to £85,000 per person, per financial institution, as long as you go with the regulated firm. And that really should give people confidence that just because you haven't heard of the bank or the building society, your money's still safe.
Okay. So Chandrika, I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, so Chandrika, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
If your hay fever's been worse than usual this year, well, you're probably not alone.
30 to 40% of the global population have some form of allergic disease.
Yeah, that's correct.
What's going on?
Oh my God, what's going on? So it's 30 to 40% now, but all the experts I spoke to said it's easily going to be 50% in the next decade. So we're just going to continue seeing a rise. And partially that's because it tends to track with socioeconomic status. So as countries move into the middle class and upper class, they tend to get more allergic disease. So it really is, the richer you get, the more problems you have.
Dr. Theresa McPhail speaking to Dr. Ranjan Chatterjee there on his podcast, Feel Better, Live More, back in June. So Chandrika, that wasn't making me feel better listening to that. What's the story?
So the news is that dangerous allergic reactions are rising in England and now cause some 25,000 NHS hospital stays a year. Health officials are saying that the rate has more than doubled over the last 20 years, which I think sometimes parents of young children might often be the first people to notice that, because children are being diagnosed at earlier ages and seemingly with more and more allergies. But this is across the age range, and it's prompting health officials to remind people how to recognise allergies and how to respond, because they can be very dangerous. For severe food-related allergic reactions, so shellfish can be a big one, the rise in admissions is even higher. So for food-related anaphylaxis and other adverse reactions, anaphylaxis is when a person's throat closes up because of their allergic reaction. The figures jumped from 1,971 admissions in 2002 to 2003 to 5,013 last year.
Obviously, we do have a larger population now than we did 20 years ago when the numbers were last done. So probably doubling isn't doubling in real terms proportionally. But even so, it seems hard to argue that there's a real concern here.
Especially because these cases are the most serious ones, because they required a hospital stay, because there are like EpiPens and other ways of treating allergic reactions that the person carries with them. So these are people who are at risk of death, which is really scary. So as you say, the population has grown, but there can be other factors going on. So according to the head of clinical services at Allergy UK, Amina Warner, there can be three things that are contributing to this rise. And the first can be like foods from other countries being more available. So things like lentils, chickpeas, kiwis. I know a lot of people are allergic to kiwi fruit, actually. Those are foods that weren't historically part of the British diet, and that could be a reason why. There could also be cross-contamination. So she mentions someone having an anaphylactic reaction after they went to a gin bar, which is surprising.
What?
I know, right? Gin is not safe. Well, it's actually what was in the gin, because it was a fancy gin bar. There was some pink peppercorn floating on top of the gin, and that cross-reacts with cashew. And this person had a cashew nut allergy.
What does that mean, cross-reacts with cashew? Does that mean there's some cashew in the environment that it picked up on, or what?
They're from the same family, I think. Yeah, which is like even more to think about. So it's like a very general nut allergy the pink peppercorn came under. And then the other one she mentions is that we have very allergenic trees in this country, one of which is a short-lived birch, and it tries to get all its pollen out en masse each season, which can sensitize someone predisposed to allergy. This is where the hay fever could come in.
I would have predicted birch trees would be the villain, Arion.
Yeah, birch trees is a really interesting one. That struck me as surprising as well. Apparently, there's a growing number being planted in the UK. I don't entirely know why that is, but it's also leading to this increase in pollen fruit syndrome. So it's triggering in people who haven't previously been allergic to something a newfound allergy. And I think that's part of the story that you're getting here. I mean, a lot of people look at particularly the rising statistics on children having allergic reactions, and they sort of intuitively, and this sort of does feel like it could make sense, leap to the idea that, it's just a sort of greater understanding that's leading to more diagnosis, because previously we just didn't know as much about allergies as we do now. And according to a BBC report that I found, the increase in allergies is not simply due to society becoming more aware of them and being better at diagnosing them, but instead scientists say that it's dietary changes, exposure to microbes and pollution that may play a role in the rise, particularly in Western lifestyles. And there is some sense that our embrace of cleanliness generally may also be triggering allergic reactions, though that's still one that I gather allergists are researching.
Yeah. I mean, I can say just anecdotally, the reason we planted a birch tree, I'm not saying I represent everyone who has, is because they're very thin, so it won't ruin our view. But Guy, this business about kind of children being wrapped in cotton wool and not being let outside and spending all their time on their iPads, I don't know if that comes under the category of victim blaming in this instance, but do you think there might be something to that people used to be out in the world more and now they're not?
I mean, reading about this, I'm not a scientist. I'm taking what others have written or said, and that does come up quite a bit. Are we mollycoddling our kids now? Are we not exposing them to as much dirt, to as many animals? And just speaking from experience, I grew up without pets. Never had a cat or a dog. When I went to university, I can remember being living with someone who had a cat, and I was terribly allergic to the cat. And listen, I can't say for certain why I was allergic to the cat, but I do wonder if part of the reason was just not having that exposure. And Arion mentioned pollution as well. Again, personally speaking to doctors, I get hay fever and I've got very mild asthma. And I can remember doctors saying to me, when you are exposed to those days when, pollution is that little bit higher in the middle of London, you do risk your hay fever in this season or your asthma being that little bit worse. So listen, there's various reasons. Something else I was going to bring up was, and this is a speculation on my part, we talked about diets being more adventurous than maybe they were, especially in the UK, compared to sort of 20 or 30 years ago. We do have greater selection of foods, whether it's from, as a result of globalization, more imports, over many decades, the choice of restaurant, the choice of food in the supermarket, speculation on my part, but I do wonder if that might also be leading to more allergies, because maybe 50, 60 years ago, our grandparents just simply weren't exposed to those sorts of foods.
Yeah, I think I can say safely, Suchandrika, that my grandmother never had pink peppercorn in gin. But, you look at the list of some of the foods that might be triggering allergies: lentils, chickpeas, kiwis. These are being grouped under all these foreign foods that have come to Britain and colonized our diets. I mean, those don't seem obscure ingredients, do they? I probably eat those things every week.
There's an interesting report on the BBC about food labelling as well, and this could be a concern too when it comes to allergies. So this is from the 20th of July. Trading standards in Devon and Somerset found 56 out of 100 food businesses violated labelling rules. So they put consumers at greater risk of allergic reactions. So we have the cross-contamination issue coming maybe from supply chains, but not having the labelling means that people can't choose what's safe for themselves and their families. So out of the 56 failed samples, 34 contained an undeclared allergen, usually milk or gluten. And I feel like lactose intolerance is something that people lose. I'll say it again. Lactose intolerance tends to become worse within adults as we get older, because we produce less lactase to help us digest milk over time. This seems like quite a difficult move for people to not know there's milk in there, especially when lots of people are moving to milk substitutes. As these businesses where the failed samples were found are being advised by trading standards officers on how to improve their practices. The fact is these contaminated substances are out there, people have bought them, and they won't find out until afterwards, after possibly a very difficult reaction has occurred or someone's very ill, that they've ingested these substances. So it's also about knowing what's in our food and drink.
Yeah, but if there is more regulation, Guy, I mean, we all remember the notorious Pret Baguette story 7 years ago. But, you know, the crackdown in retailers declaring all ingredients and allergies, fair enough if you're a big retailer, obviously, like Pret. But, I mean, if you run a business and you're listening to this and you make sandwiches, you can't keep on top of every single potential allergen that's in what you're providing, can you?
You need to. I used to sell sandwiches, by the way, when I was there 20 years ago when I was at university. And back then, you wouldn't even think about it. But you absolutely have to. I mean, that the case you referenced, Natasha, who died in 2016, she had a Pret sandwich at Heathrow, which had sesames, and she was allergic to sesames. And unfortunately, it wasn't labelled at all. And very sadly, she was on a flight to Nice, and you know, there's not much you can do when you're 40,000 feet in the air. And you know, it's an extreme case, but we can't have that happening again. But even in the cases that aren't necessarily going to lead to death, you know, I don't think we're very good in the UK at dealing with food allergies. Somebody I bring up a lot when I'm on this podcast is my wife. She seems to be related to every single topic we ever talk about, and she's got a gluten intolerance. Every time I buy food, I'm checking the label for her. You know, barley, wheat, soya. Who would have thought soya sauce is actually a problem for people that are intolerant to gluten? You simply have to put those on the labels, because she'll have a horrible night, you know, being sick. It's not Natasha who very sadly died, but that it can get incredibly serious. And I see it so often. You go to restaurants and they don't understand that, you know, they think rice is gluten when it's not. They don't understand that soya sauce is a problem. They don't understand that barley is a problem. I think we do need better labelling, because we don't have the education right now in the UK.
And I think the flip side of that same problem is a thing that's called defensive labeling, which is, you know, we'll all have encountered this, companies printing labels that say may also contain nuts, milk, soya, whatever.
Produced in an environment that was once visited by a nut.
Yeah, exactly. And as someone who has a daughter who has a peanut allergy, which may be a very serious one, we don't actually know the extent of it, that sort of labeling is really limiting in a different way. You know, of course, we need to start with, yes, let's get labels on things that tell you what's in them, but it should actually be telling you actually what's in it. It shouldn't be sort of taking a wild punt with basically companies trying to protect themselves from litigation. And what we need to know is this something that you can eat or isn't it? Because otherwise, you know, there is enough of our life that we have to fear closing the world down to our daughter about, that we don't want to have to do it unnecessarily. That's really important to us too.
Also, I suppose, Suchandrika, finally on this, just recognising if someone's having an allergic reaction, if it's a really serious one like this that might cause an admission to a hospital, I'm not sure I'd know if I was sitting in a restaurant and I saw someone else going into anaphylactic shock what that looked like.
I think more than anything, it's the panic you'd notice, especially the reactions of the people who know the person who's having the reaction. But there are some things we can look out for. So there is some advice out there. So symptoms come on very rapidly when it's anaphylactic shock, which is the most serious and most dangerous kind of reaction. It includes swelling of the throat and tongue, difficulty breathing or breathing very fast, difficulty swallowing, a tightness in the throat, or a hoarse voice. So you're most likely to hear it in them trying to speak, first of all. There'll be wheezing, coughing, or noisy breathing, feeling tired or confused, feeling faint, dizzy, or fainting. And there might be blue, grey, or pale skin, lips, or tongue, which is pretty terrifying if you're seeing that. They may also be a rash, which is swollen, raised, or itchy. The rash might exist on its own as well. It could be a sign that anaphylaxis is coming. So it's one to look out for. It's really dangerous. So people should ring 999 if they think they or someone else is having an anaphylactic shock. And people who know they're at risk should always carry 2 adrenaline pens, which they or someone else can administer in an emergency. That's actually new advice from the drugs regulator, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA. And they say that people should make sure they have their auto-injector pen and have a second one for safety and use that immediately when there are signs of anaphylaxis, but also to ring 999.
Okay. Or, of course, if you forget any of that, you can just get your smartphone out your pocket, open up your podcast app, bring up this episode, fast forward to the moment where we gave the advice, write it all down and give it to the person who's struggling. Arion, you'll be up next after this. Okay, Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
That rearranging our views on stranger danger could be a game changer.
So when it comes to actually developing the confidence to go and approach a stranger, you really just have to remember the fundamental lesson, which is that a stranger is just a friend that you haven't yet met. Now, in my experience of talking to a lot of people and going up to them on the street and getting over my own version of social anxiety, the best way to talk to a stranger is to have a goal in mind before you enter the conversation.
Ugh, flashbacks to flyering in Edinburgh for you, Suchandrika, I dare say. Talk to strangers, it will change your life. A video from the YouTube channel Sprout. Arion, what's the story?
Yeah, so the story this week is that a behavioral scientist and professor at the University of Chicago called Nicholas Epley said that more things would happen to us and we would have a more interesting life if we revived the dying art of chatting to strangers. He was interviewed by the Spanish newspaper El País about his latest research and said his conclusions are basically based on multiple experiments that he's been running in recent years aimed at explaining why we as a society have become more antisocial. And according to his recent research, as well as that of others, by the way, social contact with strangers has lots and lots of positive benefits, including that we learn more about the world, we develop a stronger sense of belonging to our communities, as well as more tangible potential benefits, including helping us land more jobs, directly improving our mental health and assisting us as we get older. So lots of potential benefits of talking to strangers.
Yeah, I mean, directly improving our mental health. I mean, it's social science, this, isn't it? But how sciencey is the science in this science, do you think? I mean, loneliness is subjective, isn't it?
Loneliness is certainly subjective, though I suppose measurable as well if you just look at how many people a person who's saying that they're lonely actually interacts with day to day. So, you know, I think that there are definitely truths to be found around the woolliness, and a lot of what I've said, I'm conscious, does have a certain woolliness to it. But, you know, Epley is actually running experiments on what happens when you talk to strangers, and they're, you know, and finding out what the barriers are to people doing it, and then what the potential benefits of it are as well. And even though, you know, some of the conclusions may sound a bit airy-fairy, actually there is some truth to the core concept, which is that there are all of these different ways that your life can improve. You know, and it's not just Epley as well, you know, that these results are being mirrored by other investigations too.
So, Chandrika, you live in central London. Have you noticed any people talking to strangers?
Do you know what? A stranger is just a podcast co-host you haven't met yet. I think this is a very interesting subject Arion's picked up on, and it's there in the video as well, but I do think it's very gendered, this idea. And you're not seeing women in any of the examples of these books. From my Googling, there's 3 books that these articles are sort of resting on. So one's by Will Buckingham, in which he talks about travelling after he lost his life partner, after they died. And he went travelling in places like Myanmar and places very different to England. Then another book is by John Yates, who runs a youth charity in London and worries about the deep social fissures between sort of different classes and people like that and so on. And then Joe Keohane, an American journalist, I didn't find as much on him, but I feel like we're sort of bundling lots of different ideas of what talking to strangers is into one. And the idea of like talking to someone on a train might not be that comfortable for people who identify as not male. And I don't think that's really been looked at in these articles. And I think possibly that's one change over the last half a century, where possibly people identify as women or as not male feel like they can say, actually, I don't want to have a conversation. And it's hard to say that because rejection isn't always taken well. It might not be romantic, the intention, but there's still a bit of a power dynamic that's awkward and changing over time. So headphones are a great way to go, actually, I'm not available. It's similar to turning someone down, not by saying you're single, but by saying you have a boyfriend when you don't. It's a safety thing. And a classic place where you try to avoid this kind of situation is the gym. You want to have headphones on in the gym. Otherwise, it's just a true story. If you go anywhere near the weights station, you're going to end up talked to, possibly married.
Okay, I mean, you make a fair point about gender. You're right. These are accounts written by men. But just to take gender out of it for a minute, I mean, if you were approached by another woman who wanted to have a conversation with you and you had your headphones on, is there still a part of you that's like, I want to be left alone? Or do you recognize that sometimes just meeting someone spontaneously is an art we've forgotten how to do and is something that's beneficial?
Again, it's all about context. So I think on the street, if a woman approached me, I'd think she'd want directions or she might be in trouble, or like on a train or something like that. But I think if we look at these articles, the experiments they talk about are not just about meeting someone on a train or meeting someone on the street. They talk about putting people together. So elderly people who feel lonely for many reasons we can imagine, putting them together with someone else. I think at heart, for me, it's about urban loneliness and lack of infrastructure and this loss of a village feeling and possibly gender dynamics, as opposed to the fact that people just don't want to talk to each other and technology is allowing that. I think there's more to it than that.
Well, technology isn't just allowing it, is it, Guy? Technology is triggering our brains to check our social media feeds and to get updates on the news and all sorts of things that we weren't concerned about in the past when we were just walking down the street.
Yeah, if you know the film Sliding Doors, where John Hannah approaches Gwyneth Paltrow on the tube. If Gwyneth Paltrow was on her iPhone, not that they had iPhones then, deep in Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, he's much less likely to approach her. I think technology definitely creates a barrier to some extent. I'm busy, but it also means because you're busy, you're less likely to talk to talk to someone else. Somewhere else, I think technology has an impact is dating apps. I met my wife on a dating app, so I'm obviously not...
I was waiting for your wife to come up.
No, and so I'm not in that environment, but I'm told people talk to each other a lot less now at bars than they used to because they don't need to, because they meet men, women, or whoever else via their dating app, their chosen dating app, and that also has an impact. I also think, though, as one of you mentioned, context is so important. I think some of us are programmed, totally understandably, to be fearful of strangers approaching us for various different reasons. But when there's a natural connection, I think it's easier. So let's say you're on a plane and you're going to sit next to someone for 7 or 8 hours. I think you're more likely there to talk to them than on the underground.
Even though they cannot escape.
Yeah. But also, where there's a natural connection, I go away with work every now and then to New York, and I often find myself in hotel bars on my own, on my laptop, talking to no one. Recently, though, I was in the bar, the Arsenal Supporters Club in New York, and I was on my own, sat next to this guy and his son, and we were chatting away for 2 hours because there was that connection. Both Arsenal fans, instant connection, all great. I'll never see him again, never see his son again, shook hands, had a good time. That wouldn't happen in the hotel bar that evening because I don't have that connection with anyone else in the bar in the same way. So I think context is also really important.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's something, Arion, that people are trying to do something about in larger cities, isn't it? Provide a context for strangers to knowingly decide to opt into a conversation.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, in Great Neck, which is a region of the state of New York, they've actually introduced this area where people can go and sit on this handful of benches where they can know that they're going to be engaged in chit-chat by other strangers who also want to make connections. And I think that's a really sort of proactive way that a city can intervene and try to do something about this. But I do think that there are exceptions, because we're not just, as you said, Suchandrika, we're not just talking about people talking to one another at random on the tube or whatever, which can convey a certain, I don't know, if not menace, then I think it certainly makes people wonder what the ulterior motive of the person that's talking to them is, if not just to tell the time. But we're also talking about, those occasions where you're in a social situation where you have the choice of either talking to the one person who you've brought there with you or talking to someone who you haven't met before. And that could present more opportunities for the kinds of interactions that could have these beneficial effects. You know, a classic is that parents who are watching their kids play in a playground often will talk, or people who have dogs who are out. You know, these are the sort of social lubricants that can facilitate getting in touch with someone where otherwise you wouldn't have had that connection. And more often than not, people in those circumstances probably aren't coming at you with some sort of, you know, negative desire in their mind. So I think that there are safe ways that this can be done, that people can experiment with themselves if they believe this sort of core premise that Epley is trying to convey, which is that, you know, talking to people can have all of these positive impacts.
Yeah, that's really interesting, the dog thing, because we got a dog just 5 months ago, and that is the thing that's changed. I mean, I live in a village in Hertfordshire. I don't live in an urban area, and yet still it's close enough to London that people basically ignore each other in the street. And yet having a dog means if you're talking to someone else with a dog, it's just an instant conversation because they're sniffing each other's genitals, like a barrier has been broken very quickly. And I suppose, Suchandrika, there is a well-being that comes from that. It is partly that you're talking to different kinds of people. You're talking to older people. Yes. You know, I will have a conversation with, you know, an elderly man on his way to get his pension that I wouldn't have had otherwise, just because we both got dogs.
Yeah, I think, again, it's this shared context of, oh, you might vaguely have seen the person around, or you know they live in the area, or if someone has a dog, you know they're settled. They have almost a stake in the society that you have as well. This is probably why people don't talk on the tube much. Yeah, it's about choosing the right kind of situation and making sure people feel safe, because the tube kind of isn't it. And I just want to refer to some of the films that are brought up in one of these articles. So they're like, oh, you know, the wonderful romance of Speaking to Strangers, Brief Encounter. That is a 1945 film, a classic from David Lean, based on Noel Coward's 1936 one-act play. So I'd say society's moved on. It's about a couple who have basically an emotional affair and not much else. Seems very sweet these days. Fine. It's, you know, it's 2023. Before Dawn, which I believe is Before Sunrise, the classic Richard Linklater film from 1995. So the real story of this is he met a woman called Amy and did walk around the city of Philadelphia with her all night in 1989. And then the film came out and he hoped that she'd get in touch. It's a hugely romantic reason here, like Brief Encounter. Romance is often at the heart of this. And she actually had died in a motorcycle accident before the film came out, which is devastating.
It's the most harebrained scheme I've ever heard of, by the way, that he's like, I'll become a filmmaker, I'll get a whole picture greenlit, and then hopefully this girl will get back in touch with me. That's just
that was 1989 dating app.
Right.
I mean, like, that was Hinge back then. Yeah, that was Hinge back then. And then they mentioned Strangers on a Train, the 1951 Hitchcock film, that's your first clue. It's about two people swapping a murder. So one takes on the other person's murder, and one of these murders is the man's own wife. I don't need to talk to that man on a train. I don't want to do the murdering. I don't want to be the murdered. No, thank you. I don't actually listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, but I believe many people do. And I don't really need to. Like, I've been followed off the tube, like, scratch the surface, you hear all these stories. I think when someone is already stressed and on the move and doesn't know if you have the same stake in the society that they live in, then they're probably going to ignore you. I think that's what it is.
That's a good point. It's a good point. But I suppose but the things you were talking about, Guy, I mean, you did give the example of sliding doors.
Another one, even though it's John Hannah.
But nonetheless, it's also just the thing of talking to someone when you're on a park bench, right? So that doesn't have to be loaded in any way. It doesn't have to be confrontational. The person can move away. Let's leave the example of public transport. Do you think we miss something when we don't talk to strangers in a park, at an attraction, at the library? Do we miss something when we don't do that?
I think we do. And also you get a good feeling about it when you've had a nice chat. Even if it's something silly, like you just help them out with a time, or directions is a great one. You just feel good. All right, I've added 0.01% to their day. That's a nice feeling.
I love that you've put a proportional value on it. I mean, Arion, is it something that in Australia is more common, by the way, talking to? I mean, you come from Sydney, which is obviously a city, but is it more friendly than London?
I think it probably is a little bit more talkative, both culturally and because we have more outdoor space and better weather to, get out there and enjoy and be outside in the first place. So probably there is more of this. I think that, some of the conditions that happened here and in the US that people talk about being behind this certainly also struck Australia, like COVID and people sort of retreating into that insular thing that's kind of behind this, as well as I think this sort of deep ossification of political divides that we're seeing, both in Britain through Brexit and in the US through the sort of the really partisan separation of Republicans and Democrats. And I think that definitely affected Australia, of people feeling like my political opponent is not just another person whose ideas I slightly disagree with, but they're actually an evil, bad person who I shouldn't have anything to do with. And I think that those, in conjunction maybe with that idea of stranger danger that emerged in the 80s, where we sort of, and subsequent generations have gone on telling children that they shouldn't be talking to strangers because they are a genuine threat to them. That's not bad advice maybe for kids, but I think if you internalize it and, grow up with it and carry it on, I think, overwhelmingly it's not supported by statistics. People tend to have crime committed to them by people that they know rather than strangers who they've just encountered for the first time. So I think that, yes, Australia is a slightly special case in that, people just are a bit more willing to chat in general, but I think that this is something that has been happening worldwide.
Well, all I'll say is that obviously if you do meet a stranger today, the very best thing you can do to break the ice is pull out their phone, open up their podcast app, and make sure they're following The Week Unwrapped wherever they get their podcasts. And you can do the same. Until next time, my thanks to Suchandrika, Arion and Guy. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer is Izzy Boujard at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.